Sophie Carson stepped off the westbound train into weak afternoon sunlight. Twin babies bundled against her chest in a makeshift double sling. The platform was crowded with townspeople, waiting for mail and supplies, their curious eyes turning toward her immediately. She searched the faces for Samuel Garrett, the man whose letters had promised her a new life, a fresh start, a home. A tall man in a pressed suit separated from the crowd and approached. His expression was pleasant until his gaze dropped to the babies. Then his face hardened like cooling iron. "You never mentioned children," Samuel said, voice flat and cold. Sophie's throat tightened. "I wrote about them in my third letter. I explained everything." "I never received a third letter." He stepped back, creating distance. "I can't take on ready-made responsibilities, Miss Carson. I'm looking for a wife, not a family." The words struck like physical blows. Sophie opened her mouth to protest, to explain, to beg, but Samuel had already turned away. He walked through the crowd without looking back, leaving her standing alone with her babies and a single trunk. The townspeople whispered. A woman in a blue bonnet nudged her companion. Two men near the freight office shook their heads. Sophie felt their judgment like cold wind cutting through her coat. She sank onto a weathered bench beside the ticket window, pulling the babies closer. The girl whimpered softly, sensing her mother's distress. Sophie blinked hard against tears, refusing to cry in front of these strangers who already thought so little of her. She had no money for return passage, no family waiting back east. Winter still clung to the frontier despite March's arrival, and she had two infants who needed warmth and food and safety. Near the freight office, a man in a worn coat watched the entire scene. He stood beside a medical bag, his weathered face showing no judgment, only recognition. His dark eyes held something Sophie couldn't quite name. Understanding, perhaps, or shared pain. He was older than Samuel, maybe 40, with gray threading his temples. His shoulders were broad but slightly hunched, as though carrying invisible weight. He watched Sophie cradle her babies, watched the town continue its whispers, and something in his expression shifted. He picked up his medical bag and took one step toward her. Then he hesitated. Sophie met his eyes across the platform. For a long moment, neither moved. The stranger seemed to be wrestling with some internal debate, his jaw working silently. Then he drew a breath and crossed the distance between them. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice gentle despite its roughness. "I'm Dr. Peter Morrison." Peter knelt beside the bench, bringing himself to Sophie's eye level. Up close, she could see the lines of exhaustion carved around his eyes, the grief that sat in them like settled dust. "I couldn't help but overhear," he continued, glancing at the babies with an expression Sophie couldn't read. "That was poorly done of Mr. Garrett." Sophie said nothing. What could she say? That she was desperate? That she'd gambled everything on a stranger's promise? The babies shifted against her and she adjusted her grip automatically. Peter was quiet for a moment, as though gathering courage. When he spoke again, his words came slowly, weighted with pain. "I lost my wife 2 years ago," he said. "Childbirth. I delivered our son myself, but I couldn't save her." He paused, swallowing hard. "He didn't survive either. Thomas. I named him Thomas." Sophie's breath caught. The raw grief in his voice was unmistakable, still fresh, despite 2 years passing. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Peter nodded, accepting the condolence without comment. He looked at the babies again, and this time Sophie recognized the expression, longing mixed with fear. "Your babies need a father who won't resent them," Peter said carefully. "Someone who understands what a gift children are, how precious and fragile." He met her eyes directly. "I need a reason to come home at night, Miss," Sophie corrected quietly. "Miss Carson. Sophie." "Sophie." He said her name like a prayer. "I need to remember what a family sounds like, what it feels like. I have a house, modest but warm, steady income from my practice, And I have medical knowledge that could keep your babies healthy through their first difficult years. Sophie stared at him, trying to process what he was suggesting. I'm not asking for love, Peter said quickly. I'm asking for a chance at healing. For both of us. A practical arrangement, partnership, not romance. The wind picked up, cutting through Sophie's thin coat. One of the babies began to cry, a thin wail that drew more stares from lingering townspeople. Sophie rocked automatically, her mind racing. This man was a stranger. But Samuel had been a stranger too, and his rejection proved that promises and letters meant nothing. At least Peter was honest about his limitations, his wounds. At least he saw her babies and didn't turn away. You don't know me, Sophie said, testing him. You don't know what circumstances brought me here, what mistakes I've made. I know you traveled alone with 2 infants, seeking a better life, Peter replied. I know you're brave and determined. The rest doesn't matter. Sophie looked down at her babies, her daughter and son, 3 months old, born from love that hadn't lasted, but innocent of any sin. They deserved better than a mother's shame dragging them down. Yes, she heard herself say. I'll marry you, Dr. Morrison. Peter's shoulders sagged with relief, so visible it was almost startling. He stood, offering his hand to help her up. Call me Peter, he said. Let's get you and these little ones out of the cold. As Peter lifted her trunk with ease, Sophie's memories rushed back unbidden. Her father's death 18 months ago, leaving nothing but debts. The broken engagement to Charles, when she'd refused to lie about the creditors circling. Discovering her pregnancy after Charles had already married someone else, someone whose family had money and status. The shame that followed. Her aunt's cold disapproval. The way former friends crossed streets to avoid her. Then Samuel's advertisement, seeking a mail-order bride. His letters describing Montana territory, a fresh start where past mistakes didn't matter. She'd written honestly about the babies, certain she had. But even if he'd never received that letter, his rejection proved what she'd always feared. She and her children were unwanted burdens. Except this stranger, this grieving doctor, was offering his arm as though she were respectable. As though her babies weren't marks of shame, but simply children needing care. How old are they? Peter asked as they walked toward town. 3 months. Fraternal twins, a boy and a girl. Healthy? Yes, thank God. They eat well, sleep reasonably. Sophie hesitated, then added, Their father wanted nothing to do with us. I'm not running from him. He's married to someone else. Peter nodded without judgment. And your family? Dead, or unwilling to help. The words came easier than expected. I have no one. Nowhere to go, no money for return passage. Then it's fortunate I found you, Peter said simply. They reached the white, clapboard church at the center of town. Peter guided her up the steps, still carrying her trunk on one shoulder. Inside, the sanctuary was dim and empty, except for a man arranging hymnals. Reverend Hayes, Peter called. I need you to perform a marriage. The Reverend turned, eyebrows rising. Dr. Morrison, I didn't know you were courting anyone. I wasn't. Peter set down the trunk. This is Sophie Carson. We're marrying today, if you're willing. Reverend Hayes looked between them, clearly confused, but too polite to refuse. Are you certain? Marriage is a sacred commitment, not to be entered lightly. I'm certain, Peter said firmly. Sophie heard the finality in his voice and drew strength from it. Miss Carson? The Reverend asked gently. Sophie looked at the babies sleeping against her chest, then at Peter's tired, honest face. She thought of the platform, Samuel's retreating back, the whispers that would follow her everywhere without a husband's protection. But more than that, she thought of Peter's words. Your babies need a father who won't resent them. I'm certain, she said. The ceremony was brief, no flowers, no music, no witnesses beyond the Reverend. Peter's hand was warm and steady when he took hers. His voice didn't waver when he spoke his vows. Sophie stumbled slightly over hers, exhausted from travel and heartbreak, but she meant every word. When Reverend Hayes pronounced them married, Peter didn't kiss her. He simply picked up her trunk again and offered his arm. "Let's go home, Sophie," he said quietly. They stepped outside into late afternoon light. The sun had broken through clouds, casting everything in pale gold. Sophie noticed tiny buds on the trees lining the street. Spring, struggling to arrive despite winters. Resistance. Peter noticed her looking. "Another month and everything will be green," he said. Montana springs come late but strong. Sophie adjusted her grip on the babies and took Peter's arm. Behind them, the church door closed with a soft click. There was no going back now. Peter's house sat at the town's edge, small but well built, with a covered porch and neat fence. As he unlocked the door, Sophie braced herself for bachelor quarters, mess, and neglect. Instead, she found a home, frozen in grief. Furniture sat covered by dust cloths, like shrouded ghosts. Heavy curtains blocked the windows, creating perpetual twilight. McMedical texts were stacked on every surface, as though Peter had tried to study his way through sorrow. A cold fireplace hadn't seen flames in months, maybe years. "I apologize for the state of things," Peter said quietly, setting her trunk down. "I stopped seeing much point in housekeeping." Sophie said nothing. The house told a story more eloquently than words. A man who'd stopped living and started merely existing. Peter led her down a short hallway and opened a door. Inside was a small bedroom, completely empty except for a wooden cradle in one corner. Dust motes floated in the dim light. "I built that cradle for Thomas," Peter said, voice carefully neutral. "Seems right for your babies to use it now." Sophie's throat tightened at the quiet generosity of this gift. "Thank you, Peter." He nodded and retreated, giving her space to settle the babies. Sophie laid them carefully in the cradle, large enough for both if they curled together. They fit perfectly, her daughter's hand resting on her son's chest as they slept. That evening, Peter cooked simple food with practiced efficiency: salt pork, beans, cornbread. They ate at a small kitchen table in silence, so thick it felt physical. Sophie tried twice to start conversation, but the words died in her throat. "What did you say to a stranger you'd married hours ago?" After supper, Peter showed her the pump for washing, the woodpile for the stove, where he kept medical supplies. His instructions were thorough and impersonal, like he was training an assistant rather than speaking to his wife. At 9 o'clock, the babies woke crying. Both Sophie and Peter moved toward the hallway simultaneously, colliding in the bedroom doorway. Peter caught her shoulder to steady her, then immediately released it. "I've got them," Sophie said quickly. "Let me help," Peter insisted. They squeezed past each other into the small room. Sophie lifted her daughter while Peter automatically reached for her son, his physician's hands competent and gentle. He examined the baby with professional efficiency, checking temperature, feeling the belly for discomfort. "Just hungry, I think," he diagnosed. They worked in awkward tandem, Sophie nursing while Peter changed the other baby, then switching. Their movements gradually synchronized, finding rhythm born of necessity rather than familiarity. When both babies were fed and content, Peter laid the boy back in the cradle with surprising tenderness. "Thomas, Peter," he murmured, so quietly Sophie almost missed it. Then louder, "What are their names?" Sophie realized she'd never said. "I haven't named them officially yet. I kept thinking their father might want to say, but he—" She trailed off. "Name them," Peter said firmly. "They're yours and mine now." Sophie looked down at her daughter's sleeping face. "Grace. And Thomas, if you'll allow it." Peter's hand stilled on the cradle's edge. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Grace and Thomas," he repeated. "Good names. Strong names." He left the room abruptly. Sophie heard his bedroom door close down the hall, then nothing. She sat beside the cradle in the darkness, listening to her babies breathe, wondering what kind of marriage she'd entered. But then lamplight bloomed from under Peter's door, spilling into the hallway. And another lamp flickered to life in the kitchen, and another in the parlor. Sophie realized Peter was lighting every lamp in the house, slowly, methodically, driving back the darkness he'd lived in for 2 years. Days found their rhythm. Peter made house calls each morning, returning by noon to help with the baby's feeding. He showed Sophie how to recognize fever, how to treat colic, which herbs helped infant digestion. His teaching was patient and thorough, his medical knowledge a gift he shared generously. Sophie discovered Peter was well respected but isolated. Townspeople greeted him politely but kept distance, as though grief were contagious. He never attended social gatherings, never lingered for conversation after church. He moved through the world like a ghost, present but not participating. Until the babies changed everything. Grace and Thomas demanded attention, their cries and laughter filling the silent house. He rocked them when they fussed, talked to them in low, soothing tones. One evening, Sophie found him in the nursery, holding Thomas and singing quietly, a lullaby in a language she didn't recognize. When he noticed her watching, he stopped abruptly. Please don't stop on my account. Peter looked down at the baby in his arms. His expression was complicated. Joy and pain intertwined so tightly they became indistinguishable. Nothing about this is the same as what I lost. Sophie moved closer, drawn by his vulnerability. Tell me about them, your wife and son. Peter was silent so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then words came slowly, carefully, like he was handling fragile things. Margaret was a banker's daughter from Chicago. We met when I was finishing medical school. She was patient and kind and completely unsuited for frontier life, but she came anyway because I asked. His voice roughened. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. I knew the risks. I told her we should wait, try again later. But she wanted the baby, wanted to give me a family. He adjusted Thomas in his arms, the baby sleeping peacefully against his chest. When her time came, I thought I could save them both. I was trained, experienced, confident. Peter's jaw tightened. But sometimes knowledge isn't enough. Sometimes babies turn wrong, and women bleed too much, and even a doctor's hands can't stop death when it comes. Sophie touched his arm gently. You did everything possible. Margaret died believing I'd saved Thomas, Peter continued, voice breaking. I let her believe it because she was leaving, and I couldn't bear to take that comfort from her. But he only lasted a few hours. I held him the whole time, sang him that lullaby, and watched him slip away. Thomas stirred in his arms, making a small sound. Peter looked down at him with fierce protectiveness. I told myself I'd never risk loving again, he said. Never open myself to that kind of loss. Then I saw you on that platform with these babies, and I thought, maybe Providence is offering second chances. Maybe. Sophie realized tears were running down her face. I was angry at God, at the world, at myself for being foolish enough to love someone who wouldn't stay. Then Samuel rejected us too, and I thought perhaps we were meant to be alone. Punishment for my mistakes. Peter shook his head firmly. No child is a mistake. No life is punishment. These babies are blessings, Sophie. Anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve them. She'd carried shame for so long, armor against a world that judged her. But Peter saw no shame. He saw children who needed love, and a woman brave enough to fight for them. Thank you, she said simply. Peter began uncovering furniture that night, removing dust cloths and opening curtains. Sophie helped, the house gradually emerging from its shroud. Through the windows, she noticed buds on the trees had begun opening, tiny leaves unfurling in defiance of lingering cold. When Peter's hand brushed hers, reaching for the same dust cloth, neither pulled away immediately. Monday, she'd fashioned a double cradle from a vegetable crate lined with blankets, allowing her to carry both babies. The general store was busy with women shopping, their conversations falling silent when she entered. Sophie approached the counter with her short list, the store looking her up and down with barely concealed disdain. "Mrs. Morrison," she said coldly. "I heard Dr. Morrison married suddenly. Very suddenly." "Yes, ma'am." Sophie kept her voice level. "I need flour, sugar, and salt, please." Mrs. Henley made no move to fill the order. "We don't extend credit to unknowns, especially not to unwed mothers passing themselves off as respectable." The words hit like slaps. Behind her, Sophie heard women whispering, "Those aren't his babies." Poor Dr. Morrison, so desperate. Damaged goods, that's what she is. Sophie's face burned. She fumbled in her reticule for the coins Peter had given her, hands shaking. "I have cash," she managed. Mrs. Henley took the money but handled Sophie's purchases roughly, practically throwing them across the counter. Sophie gathered everything quickly, babies beginning to fuss at her distress, and fled the store. Outside, tears blurred her vision. She stumbled toward home, shame crushing her chest. By the time she reached Peter's house, she was sobbing. Peter found her in the kitchen an hour later, babies fed and sleeping, while Sophie sat staring at nothing. He listened silently as she explained what happened. "You can still annul this," Sophie said desperately. "I've ruined your reputation." "People will think—" "Let them think what they want," Peter interrupted, voice hard. "My reputation was already ruined by 2 years of grief, making me useless to anyone. You and these babies have given me purpose again, Sophie. I won't apologize for that. But the things they said are cruel and unjust." Peter knelt before her chair. "Tomorrow is Sunday. We'll attend church together as a family. Let the town say what it will." Sophie shook her head. "I can't face more judgment." "Yes, you can," Peter said firmly. "Because you're stronger than their small-mindedness. Because your children deserve to see their mother hold her head high. Because I'll be beside you, and I won't let anyone make you feel ashamed." Sunday arrived too quickly. Sophie dressed carefully, hands shaking as she fixed her hair. Peter wore his best suit and carried Grace, while Sophie carried Thomas. Together they walked to the white clapboard church. Conversations died as they entered. Faces turned. People shifted in pews, some moving to create distance. Sophie wanted to run, but Peter's hand on her elbow kept her steady. They sat in the middle section. Around them the whispers built like gathering storm clouds. Reverend Hayes's sermon seemed pointed. Heavy emphasis on bearing the consequences of sin, on the importance of moral purity, on how actions have repercussions. Whether intentional or not, every word felt aimed at Sophie. After the service, most people avoided them entirely. A few offered tight smiles to Peter while ignoring Sophie completely. She felt invisible and hypervisible simultaneously, judged but unworthy of direct acknowledgement. Then an older woman approached. She was thin and weathered, wearing a plain dress and practical bonnet. Her eyes were kind. "Mrs. Morrison," she said quietly, "I'm Martha Webb. I lost my husband 5 years ago and know what it's like to feel alone in a crowd." She glanced at the babies. "You're braver than most people here realize. Don't let them crush your spirit." Martha squeezed Sophie's hand once, then moved away before anyone could see the gesture clearly. It was a small kindness, but it felt like salvation. Walking home, Peter said, "Martha's right. You're brave, Sophie." "I don't feel brave," Sophie admitted. "I feel afraid." "Bravery isn't the absence of fear," Peter replied. "It's moving forward despite it." 4 days later, Grace developed a fever. Sophie noticed it first during the evening feeding. The baby felt too warm, her skin flushed and dry. She called for Peter immediately. He examined Grace with professional efficiency, but Sophie saw his hands trembling. He checked her temperature, listened to her breathing, examined her throat and ears. "Fever," he confirmed unnecessarily. "Could be several things. We need to cool her down, keep her hydrated. Watch for complications. They worked through the night. Peter applied cool cloths, while Sophie tried to coax Grace to nurse. The baby was fussy and lethargic by turns, her small body fighting some invisible infection. Around midnight, Peter's careful control began cracking. His hand shook worse. Sweat beaded his forehead despite the cool room. When Grace's fever spiked higher, he made a sound like a wounded animal. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't do this again." Sophie looked up from changing the cool cloth and saw terror in his eyes. Not the normal parental fear, but something deeper, rawer. Trauma resurfacing. "Peter," she said firmly. He didn't respond, staring at Grace like he was watching death approach. "Peter," Sophie repeated, grabbing his hands. "Look at me." His eyes finally focused on her face. "You're not alone this time," Sophie said fiercely. "You have me. We're doing this together. And Grace is strong. She's going to be fine." "You don't know that," Peter said brokenly. "I couldn't save them. My wife, my son. I watched them die, and I couldn't stop it. What if I can't save her either? What if—" "Stop." Sophie squeezed his hands hard. "You're not the same man you were then. You're not frozen by grief anymore. You've been teaching me for weeks about medicine, about care, about hope. Don't abandon that now." Peter drew a shuddering breath. "I'm so afraid, Sophie." "I know." She pulled him close, letting him rest his forehead against hers. "I'm afraid too, but we face it together." Slowly, Peter's trembling eased. He straightened, taking another deep breath, and returned his attention to Grace. They worked in tandem through the long night, cooling, soothing, medicating, praying. Thomas woke and needed feeding. Peter handled him while Sophie nursed Grace, trying to get fluids into the sick baby. They traded tasks without speaking, communication reduced to gestures and glances. Dawn was breaking when Grace's fever finally broke. Sophie felt the change first, the baby's skin cooling, her breathing easier. She checked quickly, afraid to believe, then sagged with relief. "Peter," she whispered, "her fever's down." Peter crossed the room in 2 strides, examining Grace with shaking hands. When he confirmed Sophie's assessment, something in him broke open completely. He collapsed into the rocking chair, pulling Grace against his chest, and wept. Sophie had never seen a man cry like that, deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere primal. She knelt beside him, one hand on his knee, and let him grieve everything he'd been holding back. "I love her," Peter finally gasped. "I love both of them. And you, Sophie, I love you. I tried not to, tried to keep distance, but I can't. I love this family, and the thought of losing any of you—" "You won't," Sophie interrupted. "We're not going anywhere." Peter looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. "How can you promise that? Life is fragile. Death comes when it wants." "You're right," Sophie agreed. "We can't control death, but we can control how we live. We can choose love even when it's terrifying. We can build family even when we're afraid of losing it." She stood and wrapped her arms around him, careful of Grace sleeping peacefully between them. "We're healing each other, Peter," she whispered. "That's what families do. They heal the broken places by loving anyway." Peter's free arm came around her waist, holding tight. They stayed that way as dawn light filled the room, husband, wife, and child, bound together by choice and love, and the courage to try again despite every reason to stay closed. When Thomas began fussing from the cradle, Peter actually laughed, exhausted, relieved, incredulous. "Our son has terrible timing," he said. "Our son." Sophie felt the words settle into her chest like warmth. "Yes," she agreed, smiling through tears. "He does." Sunday arrived with bright spring sunshine. Sophie expected Peter to be exhausted after the difficult week, but he rose early and dressed carefully. "We're going to church," he announced. Sophie hesitated. "Peter, after last time, nothing changed," he interrupted. "I was silent. I let their judgment stand unchallenged." Not today. They prepared the babies and walked to church as a family. Sophie felt every eye on them as they entered, heard the whispers starting immediately. Peter kept his head high, guiding her to their usual pew. Reverend Hayes began with announcements, upcoming socials, building fund, community needs. Then he asked if anyone had other business to share. Peter stood. The congregation fell silent. Reverend Hayes looked surprised, but nodded permission. "Most of you know me," Peter began, voice steady and clear. "I've lived in this town 12 years. I've delivered your babies, set your broken bones, sat with your dying. I've been your physician through every crisis." He paused, looking around the sanctuary. 2 years ago, I lost my wife and newborn son. I retreated from life, from community, from everything that made existence bearable. I was a broken man, useful to no one, barely functional. His hand found Sophie's shoulder. Then Providence brought Sophie and our children to me. The emphasis on our children was unmistakable. "Yes, our children," Peter continued firmly. "Thomas and Grace Morrison. I claim them fully, by choice, by love, by the commitment I made before God and this community when I married their mother." Someone shifted uncomfortably in a back pew. Peter's gaze swept over everyone. "This community taught me that medicine can heal bodies, but family heals souls. My wife and children saved my life by giving me reason to live again. If you judge Sophie for circumstances beyond her control, you judge wrongly. But judge me if you must, for being grateful, for loving fiercely, for choosing life over grief." His voice strengthened with conviction. "These babies didn't ask to be born. They're innocent of any sin you might imagine. They deserve love and protection and acceptance. And I will provide that whether this town approves or not." Martha Webb stood suddenly. "I support the Morrisons," she said clearly. "Dr. Morrison speaks truth. We've all needed grace at some point." The blacksmith rose next, nodding. Then the school teacher. Then a young couple Peter had helped through difficult childbirth. One by one, people stood, not everyone, but enough. Reverend Hayes surveyed his congregation, then spoke with unexpected warmth. "Dr. Morrison reminds us that mercy triumphs over judgment. That family is built on love, not circumstance. That second chances are God's gift to all of us." He smiled at Sophie directly. "Welcome to our community, Mrs. Morrison. Welcome, Thomas and Grace. May you find belonging here." After the service, people approached, tentatively at first, then with increasing warmth. The blacksmith's wife asked to hold Grace. The school teacher invited them to the church social. Martha hugged Sophie fiercely. Not everyone softened. Mrs. Henley remained cold. Several families kept distance. But the atmosphere had shifted fundamentally. Peter's public declaration created space for acceptance, permission for kindness. Walking home, Grace asleep on Peter's shoulder and Thomas in Sophie's arms, they looked like any normal family. The spring afternoon was warm, trees now fully leafed, gardens beginning to bloom. "You were magnificent," Sophie said quietly. Peter shook his head. "I was honest, that's all." Honesty takes courage. So does loving again after loss. Peter looked at her seriously. "You taught me that, Sophie. You and these babies showed me that protecting my heart wasn't living. It was just a slower way of dying." Sophie slipped her free hand into his. They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence, their joined hands swinging gently between them. Spring settled fully over Montana, transforming the landscape. Peter's house, their house now, filled with life in ways Sophie couldn't have imagined 2 months ago. Curtains stayed open, flooding rooms with light. Fresh flowers appeared on tables. Baby clothes dried on the line. The gardens Sophie planted began producing vegetables. Grace and Thomas grew stronger, beginning to roll over, responding to their names, reaching for their parents with increasing coordination. The town gradually integrated them. Sophie joined the women's auxiliary, her skill with medicinal herbs making her valuable. Peter resumed full medical practice with renewed energy, no longer retreating into isolation after difficult cases. The Morrison family became simply another family, imperfect, ordinary, accepted. One evening in June, Peter returned from a house call to find Sophie in the garden. She knelt among the vegetables, dressed dusty, babies playing on a blanket nearby. Thomas had discovered grass. Pull at it with fascination while Grace watched birds with intense concentration. The scene stopped Peter in his tracks. Domestic peace, hard-won and precious, unfolding before him like answered prayer. He joined Sophie in the garden, kneeling beside her despite his good trousers. "I never thanked you properly," he said. Sophie looked up, confused. "For what?" "For seeing past my grief that day at the station. For trusting me with your children, our children. For showing me that love isn't weakness, but the bravest thing we do." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "You saw them as blessings when everyone else saw burdens. You gave us a home when we had nothing. If anyone should be grateful, Peter, it's me. Then we're even." Peter brushed dirt from her cheek tenderly. "I've been thinking about the future. Maybe expanding the house, adding another bedroom. Maybe teaching you more medicine so you can assist with patients. Maybe," he hesitated, "maybe giving Thomas and Grace siblings someday, if you're willing." Sophie's breath caught. The possibility of more children, chosen and planned and wanted, felt almost impossibly hopeful. "I'm willing," she whispered. Thomas crawled toward Peter, demanding attention with imperious babbles. Peter scooped him up easily, then reached for Grace with his other arm. Both babies settled against him, content and trusting. Sophie stood and brushed off her skirts. Together they walked toward the house, Peter carrying both twins while Sophie gathered the blanket. At the doorway, Peter paused. The setting sun cast everything in golden light. Behind them, the garden grew lush and green. Before them, the house waited, warm, welcoming. Home. "Do you remember that first day?" Peter asked quietly. "You sitting alone on that platform, heartbroken, future uncertain?" "I remember," Sophie said. "That stranger who rejected you did us both a favor," Peter continued. "He couldn't see what he was turning away. But I saw treasure where he saw inconvenience. Providence where he saw a problem." Sophie leaned against his shoulder. "Providence knew what we needed before we did. A family built not on perfect circumstances, but on courage to love anyway." Peter shifted the babies to kiss her forehead. "Let's go inside, Mrs. Morrison." They crossed the threshold together, door standing open behind them, no longer closed against the world, but welcoming. Through the windows, lamplight glowed, warm and steady. In the parlor, Peter settled into the rocking chair with both babies while Sophie prepared supper. Their voices mingled, his low murmur, her soft humming, the twins' contented sounds. The house breathed with life it had lacked for years, filled with the ordinary, sacred moments that make a family. Later, after the babies slept and supper dishes were washed, Sophie and Peter sat on the porch watching stars emerge. His arm rested across her shoulders, her head tilted against his chest. They didn't need words. Comfort and belonging spoke louder than any declaration. In the Wild West, family wasn't always born. Sometimes it was chosen, forged through hardship and sustained by stubborn love. Sometimes Providence closed one door firmly to redirect you toward the right one. Sometimes the burden one person rejected became another's greatest blessing. The Morrison family was proof of all these truths. 2 wounded people and 2 innocent babies, Building home from broken pieces. Proving that the best families aren't found but formed, one difficult, courageous choice at a time.